The Galactic Council were fucking insane, betting the survival of the entire galaxy on the batshit craziness of humans. What the hell had convinced them that mankind could accomplish the impossible this time? Matthew Green stormed down the hallway of the Galactic Council chambers, his heavy boots echoing off the polished marble floors. The grizzled mercenary had been urgently summoned by the Council, and he had a bad feeling about what they wanted. As he reached the massive double doors leading into the Council room, they swung open to reveal Wren, a tall and slender Evora diplomat. Her iridescent scales shimmered under the bright lights. "Matthew Green, thank you for coming on such short notice," Wren said, her melodic voice tinged with a hint of desperation. "Cut the crap, Wren, what's this about?" Matthew growled. Wren's expression turned grim. "The Zaraxian Empire has conquered our homeworld. They're using it as a staging ground for further invasions. But that's not the worst part." She paused, as if struggling to find the right words. "Our intelligence suggests they're building a superweapon capable of destroying entire star systems. We're already spread thin fighting them on multiple fronts. That's why." Wren took a deep breath. "The Council has voted to entrust this mission to your people. You're the only ones crazy enough to have a chance." Matthew barked out a laugh. "You've got to be kidding me. You want us to clean up your mess?" Wren's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps this will convince you." She tapped a button on the table, and a holographic recording sprang to life. Matthew watched in horror as the Zaraxian Emperor mercilessly executed Evora civilians, their screams echoing through the Council chambers. The recording shifted, displaying schematics of a gargantuan superweapon nearing completion. Matthew's fists clenched as a cold fury washed over him. "All right, I'm in, but I'm doing this my way. Give me the Odysseus and my team." Wren nodded solemnly. "The fate of the galaxy rests in your hands, Matthew. May the stars guide you." As Matthew strode out of the Council chambers, he knew this would be the most audacious mission of his life. Infiltrate the Evora homeworld, destroy the superweapon, and take out the Zaraxian Emperor. It was a plan so insane, so reckless, that only humans could pull it off. And if they failed, well, there wouldn't be a galaxy left to worry about. Matthew Green stared at the holodisplay, his brow furrowed. The Odysseus was hurtling through hyperspace towards the Evora homeworld, but the journey was far from peaceful. His team had been analyzing the intelligence provided by the Galactic Council, and the news was grim. "Those Zaraxian bastards have the superweapon locked down tight," growled Jack, the recon specialist. He pointed at the display, which showed a dense network of anti-spacecraft cannons surrounding the construction site. "No way we're getting close in the Odysseus. It'd be blown to bits." Matthew leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. They couldn't give up, not with the fate of the galaxy at stake. Suddenly an idea struck him. He pulled up a diagram of the planet's asteroid belt. "What if we hide inside one of these rocks, have the Odysseus launch it towards the planet, make it look like a natural occurrence? The Zaraxians wouldn't suspect a thing." Sarah, the pilot, nodded slowly. "It could work. We'd have to time it perfectly, but I could plot a course that would put the asteroid in the lower atmosphere. From there we could use drop pods to land in the jungle near the site." Matthew grinned. "Exactly. And while we're infiltrating, the Odysseus can stage a diversion on the other side of the planet. Draw their forces away." The team set to work, preparing for the audacious plan. Matthew was just about to head to the armory when his comm pinged with an incoming message. He frowned at the encrypted code, not recognizing the sender. The message was short, but it sent a chill down Matthew's spine. "You have a traitor on board. One of your team has been communicating with the Zaraxians." Attached were snippets of intercepted transmissions, and Matthew's blood boiled as he recognized the voice. Zack, their weapons specialist. He stormed down to the weapons bay, finding Zack alone, hunched over a workbench. "What the hell is this?" Matthew snarled, slamming the datapad down in front of Zack. Matthew's hand dropped to his sidearm, his face a mask of fury. "You sold us out, betrayed everything we stand for." Zack made a desperate lunge for a weapon, but Matthew was faster. They grappled, knocking over crates of ammunition. Zack managed to land a solid punch, sending Matthew reeling. Just as Zack was about to bring a wrench down on Matthew's head, a blast of electricity arced across the room, dropping Zack to the floor. Mike, the engineer, stood in the doorway, a modified stun gun in his hand. "I always knew there was something off about that guy," he muttered, helping Matthew to his feet. They dragged Zack to the brig, locking him in a cell. Matthew stared through the bars, his mind whirling. The Zeraxians knew they were coming. The element of surprise was gone. He needed to rethink everything, and fast. The Odysseus dropped out of hyperspace, the lush green world of the Evora homeworld filling the view screen. Matthew gazed at the planet, his resolve hardening. Traitor or no traitor, they had a mission to complete, and he'd be damned if he let the Zeraxians win. Matthew's hands flew over the Odysseus controls, his mind racing. The traitor had fucked them, but he wasn't about to let that stop him. He punched in new coordinates, his eyes narrowed. "Change of plans," he barked into the comm. "We're dropping the asteroid play and going straight for the surface. Strap in and prepare for a hot landing." Sarah's voice crackled over the link. "Roger that, boss. Plotting new course now." The Odysseus shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, the verdant sphere of the Evora homeworld looming before them. Matthew slammed his fist on the drop pod release, and the ship lurched as the pods blasted towards the planet. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky, tracer rounds whizzing past the pod's viewports. Matthew gritted his teeth as he watched 1, 2, 3 pods wink out on his display, shot down by the Zeraxian guns. Mike's vitals flatlined, and Matthew felt a surge of rage. The kid was a good engineer, and now he was space dust because of that fucking traitor. The jungle canopy rushed up to meet Matthew's pod, and he braced for impact. The pod slammed into the ground, throwing Matthew against his harness. He shook his head to clear it, then kicked open the hatch, pulse rifle at the ready. Sarah and Lars had landed nearby, their pods scorched but intact. They nodded to Matthew as they fanned out, scanning the dense foliage for threats. Suddenly, blaster fire erupted from the trees, stitching a line of smoking holes in the ground at their feet. Matthew dove for cover, his rifle barking as he squeezed off a burst at the unseen attackers. "Zeraxian patrol!" Sarah shouted, her own weapon chattering. The firefight was brutally quick, the humans' superior reflexes and training winning out over the Zeraxians' numbers. As the last alien fell, Matthew approached the bodies cautiously, his rifle trained on them. "Check out their gear," he ordered, towing one of the corpses over. Lars bent down, examining the Zeraxians' equipment. "Shit, boss, look at this. High-end thermal optics, pheromone trackers. This is top-of-the-line human hunting kit." Matthew's jaw clenched. The Zeraxians had known they were coming, and they had prepared accordingly. Zack's betrayal had cut deeper than he thought. "Double time it, people," he said, checking the charge on his rifle. "Our window is closing fast. And keep an eye out for Mike and the others. If anyone could survive a crash landing, it's that crazy bastard." With that, Matthew plunged into the jungle, Sarah and Lars flanking him. The Odysseus's diversion had bought them some time, but he knew the Zeraxians would be on them again soon. They had to reach the construction site before it was too late. As they marched, Matthew kept one eye on his comm unit, hoping against hope to see Mike's vitals flicker back to life. But the display remained stubbornly dark, and Matthew felt the weight of command settling heavily on his shoulders. He had led his team into this mess, and he was going to lead them out or die trying. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the oppressive heat and the constant buzz of alien insects wearing on their nerves. But Matthew pushed forward, his mind focused on the mission. The Zeraxians had made a fatal mistake by underestimating humanity's resolve, and now they were going to pay for it. They were going to. One way or another, this ended today. Matthew was going to make sure of that. Matthew crashed through the underbrush, his pulse rifle at the ready. Sarah and Lars flanked him, their eyes scanning the dense foliage for any sign of danger. The jungle was a maze of tangled vines and towering trees, the air thick with humidity and the cries of alien birds. Suddenly a figure emerged from the shadows, weapon raised. Matthew's finger tightened on the trigger, but Sarah held up a hand. "Wait," she hissed. "Look at his uniform." The figure wore the distinctive green and gold of the Evora rebels, a ragtag band of guerrilla fighters who had been waging a desperate war against the Zaraxian occupiers. Matthew lowered his rifle, and the rebel did the same. "You're human," the rebel said, his voice tinged with surprise. "What brings you to this hellhole?" "We're here to take out the Zaraxian superweapon," Matthew replied. "Can you take us to your leader?" The rebel nodded, motioning for them to follow. He led them deeper into the jungle, to a hidden camp nestled in a small clearing. Makeshift tents and lean-tos were scattered among the trees, and a motley assortment of Evora rebels milled about, cleaning weapons and tending to wounds. In the center of the camp stood a tall, muscular Evora, with a jagged scar running down his cheek. He turned as Matthew approached, his eyes narrowing. "I am Tarek," he said, his voice deep and commanding, "leader of the Evora resistance. Who are you, and why have you come to our camp?" Matthew introduced himself and his team, explaining their mission and the dire stakes involved. Tarek listened intently, his expression grave. "The Zaraxians have brought nothing but death and destruction to our world," he said. "We have fought them for years, but their weaponry is far superior to our own." Suddenly a familiar voice rang out from across the camp. "Matthew, is that you?" Matthew spun around, his eyes widening. There, emerging from one of the tents, was Mike, along with the other survivors from the drop pods. They were battered and bruised, but alive. "Mike!" Matthew exclaimed, clasping his friend's hand. "I thought you were dead." Mike grinned, wincing slightly from a gash on his forehead. "Takes more than a few Zaraxian guns to put me down. The rebels found us in the wreckage, brought us back here." Matthew turned back to Tarek, his resolve hardening. "Tarek, we need your help. The Zaraxians are close to completing their superweapon, and if they succeed, countless worlds will be destroyed." Tarek's eyes flashed with anger. "We have lost too much to the Zaraxians already. We will aid you in any way we can." He spread out a map of the area, pointing to a spot deep in the jungle. "Our scouts have reported increased activity here, near the old ruins. We believe this is where they are building the weapon." Matthew studied the map, his mind racing. "The Zaraxian Emperor himself is overseeing the final stages," he said. "He's set to depart the planet in a matter of days, once the weapon is operational. We have to strike now, before it's too late." Tarek nodded, his expression determined. "We can use our knowledge of the jungle to sneak your team into the construction site under the cover of darkness. My rebels will create a diversion, draw the Zaraxian forces away from the site. That should give you the opening you need to infiltrate the main control room and plant the explosives." Matthew clasped Tarek's hand, a fierce grin spreading across his face. "Let's blow these bastards back to the Stone Age." But before they could begin to put their plan into action, a massive explosion rocked the camp. Screams filled the air as rebels ran for cover, grabbing weapons and shouting orders. Matthew and his team sprang into action, their human reflexes and training giving them an edge over the Zaraxian soldiers who poured into the camp. They fought side by side with the rebels, the air thick with the smell of ozone and burnt flesh. In the chaos of the battle, Matthew caught sight of a hulking Zaraxian soldier barking orders, his armor adorned with the insignia of a high-ranking general. This was the monster responsible for countless atrocities, a cruel and ruthless leader known for his brutality. Without hesitation, Matthew charged towards the general, dodging blaster fire and leaping over fallen bodies. The general turned, his eyes widening in surprise, as Matthew barreled into him, knocking him to the ground. They grappled in the dirt, trading blows with savage intensity. The general was strong, his muscles enhanced by Zaraxian bioengineering, but Matthew was fueled by pure human fury. He hammered his fists into the general's face, feeling bones crunch beneath his knuckles. With a final desperate heave, Matthew wrapped his hands around the general's throat and squeezed with all his might. The Zaraxian thrashed and gurgled, his eyes bulging, but Matthew didn't let go until he felt the alien go limp beneath him. Staggering to his feet, Matthew surveyed the battlefield. The Zaraxian forces were in disarray, their leader dead, and their ranks thinned by the rebels' guerrilla tactics. But he knew this was only a temporary reprieve. "We have to move now," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke and the shouting. "The Zaraxians will regroup and tighten security around the superweapon. This may be our only chance." Tarek nodded, his face grim. "We will prepare for the assault. May the gods of war smile upon us this day." As the rebels began to gather their weapons and tend to their wounded, Matthew looked to his team. They were battered and exhausted, but the fire of determination still burned in their eyes. They had come too far to turn back now. Matthew led his strike team through the shadows of the superweapon construction site, the handful of Evora rebels flanking them. Tarek guided them through the labyrinth of scaffolding and equipment, his knowledge of the Zaraxian patrols allowing them to slip by undetected. As they neared the main control room, a group of Zaraxian engineers emerged from a side corridor. Before they could raise the alarm, Sarah and the rebels were on them, subduing the engineers with silent efficiency. They bound and gagged the engineers, leaving them hidden in a storage room. "Lars, get those explosives planted," Matthew ordered. "We need to be ready to blow this place sky high." The demolitions expert nodded, slipping away towards the superweapons power core. Matthew and Sarah turned their attention to the control room's computers, their fingers flying over the alien keyboards as they hacked into the Zaraxian systems. "I'm in," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the data. "Looks like the Emperor is preparing to leave the planet. He's in an underground hangar beneath the site." He turned to Mike and Lars, who had just returned from planting the explosives. "You two stay here and finish prepping the charges. Once we're clear, light this place up." Mike grinned, slapping a detonator into Matthew's hand. "Give 'em hell, boss." Matthew, Sarah, and Tarek raced through the corridors, following the schematics they'd downloaded from the Zaraxian computers. As they neared the hangar, they ran into the Emperor's elite guard. Blaster fire filled the air as the two groups clashed. Tarek was a whirlwind of motion, his Evora blades slicing through Zaraxian armor like it was paper. Matthew and Sarah laid down covering fire, their human reflexes allowing them to dodge the guard's shots. They pushed forward, leaving a trail of Zaraxian bodies in their wake. As they reached the hangar, they saw the Emperor's ship preparing for takeoff, its engines roaring to life. "We're too late," Sarah shouted over the din. He sprinted towards the ship, Sarah hot on his heels. Just as the landing gear began to retract, they leaped, grabbing onto the hydraulic pistons. The ship lifted off, the wind whipping at their clothes as they clung to the landing gear. With a grunt of effort, Matthew pulled himself up, finding a maintenance hatch. He wrenched it open, helping Sarah inside. They found themselves in a service corridor, the sounds of the Emperor's bodyguards echoing from up ahead. Back in the hangar, Tarek fought like a man possessed, his blades a blur as he held off the remaining Zaraxian forces. He knew every second he bought was another second for Matthew and Sarah to complete their mission. As the Emperor's ship tore through the atmosphere, Matthew and Sarah fought their way through the bodyguards, the close quarters of the ship's corridors working to their advantage. They were battered and bleeding, but they didn't slow down. The fate of the galaxy drove them forward, a fire in their veins. This ended today, one way or another. Matthew would make sure of that. Matthew and Sarah fought their way through the Emperor's ship, pulse rifles barking as they cut down the Zaraxian guards in their path. The corridors were narrow and dimly lit, the air thick with the stench of ozone and burnt flesh. As they neared the bridge, a wave of psychic energy slammed into them, driving them to their knees. The Emperor's laughter echoed in their minds, a cruel and mocking sound. "Foolish humans," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You really thought you could challenge me?" Sarah gritted her teeth, her own psychic powers flaring to life. She threw up a mental shield around herself and Matthew, blocking the Emperor's attack. Matthew looked at her in surprise, but there was no time for questions. They surged forward, bursting onto the bridge in a hail of blaster fire. The Emperor stood before them, his dark robes billowing in the recycled air. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, his face twisted in a sneer. "Your resistance is futile," he hissed, his hands crackling with psychic energy. "Kneel before me, and I may spare your miserable lives." Matthew and Sarah exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They opened fire, their shots ricocheting off the Emperor's psychic shield. The Emperor laughed, a sound that chilled their blood. He lashed out with his mind, trying to crush their wills, to bend them to his own. Sarah pushed back, her psychic powers straining against the Emperor's. Matthew felt her shield around him waver and then strengthen, a wall of mental force that held the Emperor at bay. They circled each other, trading blows both physical and mental. Meanwhile, back at the construction site, Mike and Lars raced through the superweapons corridors, planting the last of the explosives. The timer was set, the countdown begun. But as they made their way towards the exit, they found their path blocked by a horde of Zaraxian soldiers. Blaster bolts filled the air as Mike and Lars dove for cover. They returned fire, their human reflexes and training giving them an edge. But the Zaraxians kept coming, a seemingly endless tide of armored bodies. Lars checked the detonator, his face grim. The remote signal was being jammed, the detonator useless. He looked at Mike, a silent understanding passing between them. "I'll stay behind," Lars said, his voice steady. "Manually detonate the charges. You get out of here, make sure those bastards pay for what they've done." Mike fought his way out of the facility, tears blurring his vision as he heard the explosions begin behind him. Lars had done it, sacrificed himself to ensure the superweapon's destruction. On the Emperor's ship, Matthew and Sarah were locked in a stalemate with the Emperor. His psychic powers were immense, but together they were holding him back. Suddenly the ship rocked violently as a massive explosion tore through the construction site below. The Emperor staggered, his concentration broken for a split second. Matthew seized the opportunity, lunging forward with a roar. His pulse blade flashed, slicing through the Emperor's psychic shield and burying itself in his chest. The Emperor's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening in a silent scream. He crumpled to the floor, black blood pooling around him. Alarms blared as the ship began to lose control, explosions ripping through its hull. Matthew grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her towards the escape pods. They fought their way through the crumbling corridors, dodging falling debris and sparking wires. They reached the pods just as the ship began to break apart around them. They strapped themselves in, Matthew slamming his fist on the launch button. The pod blasted free of the dying ship, hurtling towards the planet's surface below. Through the viewport, they watched as the Emperor's ship disintegrated in a ball of fire, a final, fitting end to his reign of terror. The escape pods cracked open with a hiss, disgorging Matthew and Sarah onto the scorched earth of the Evora homeworld. They stumbled out, their bodies aching from the battle aboard the Emperor's ship and the rough landing. The acrid stench of smoke and burnt metal hung heavy in the air. "Matthew, Sarah!" a voice called out. They turned to see Mike and Tarek picking their way through the debris, their faces smeared with soot and blood. The four gathered together, their eyes instinctively searching for the fifth member of their team. But Lars was gone, sacrificing himself to destroy the Zaraxian superweapon and give them a fighting chance. A heavy silence settled over the group as they mourned their fallen comrade. Matthew cleared his throat, pushing down the grief that threatened to overwhelm him. They didn't have time for that now. "The Emperor is dead, and the superweapon is destroyed, but we're not done yet. The Zaraxians won't take this lying down." Tarek nodded, his eyes hard. "Reinforcements will be here soon. We need to strike now while they're in disarray." "What do you have in mind?" Sarah asked, wiping a trickle of blood from her forehead. Tarek gestured to the horizon, where plumes of smoke rose from distant battles. "We rally the rebel cells, coordinate a planet-wide uprising, hit the Zaraxians from all sides before they can regroup." Matthew's mind raced, a plan forming. "We'll need to get the word out, inspire the people to fight. If we can take control of the communication network, broadcast a message of hope." "Call to arms," Mike said, a grim smile on his face. "I like it." They set to work, dividing tasks based on their strengths. Matthew and Tarek would lead the assault on the communication hub, a heavily guarded Zaraxian stronghold. Sarah and Mike were tasked with sabotaging key military installations and supply lines, weakening the Xeraxian forces from within. As they prepared to split up once more, Matthew clasped each of his team members' shoulders, looking them in the eye. "We've come this far, we've lost good people, but we're not finished yet. Let's make their sacrifices count. Let's show these Xeraxian bastards what humans are made of." With a final nod, they parted ways, each determined to see their insane plan through to the end. The Evora homeworld would be free, or they would die trying. Matthew and Tarek moved through the war-torn streets, rallying rebel fighters as they went. The Evora, long oppressed by the Xeraxians, flocked to their banner, their eyes alight with a newfound hope. They struck hard and fast, catching Xeraxian patrols off guard and seizing their weapons. As their numbers swelled, they launched their attack on the communication hub. Tarek led the charge, his blades flashing in the sun as he cut through the Xeraxian defenders. Matthew was right beside him, his pulse rifle spitting death with every pull of the trigger. They fought their way into the heart of the complex, the rebels' fierce determination overpowering the Xeraxians' superior technology. In the central control room, Matthew worked frantically to override the security protocols, his fingers flying over the alien keyboards. "People of Evora, this is Matthew Green of the Human Alliance. The Xeraxian Emperor is dead, his superweapon destroyed. But the fight is not over. Even now the Xeraxians seek to tighten their grip on your world, to crush your spirit once and for all. But they have underestimated you. They have underestimated your courage, your resilience, your unbreakable will. Rise up, people of Evora. Rise up and take back what is yours. Fight for your families, for your future. Fight for freedom. Today we stand together. Today we strike as one. Today Evora will be free." Across the planet, rebels and civilians alike took up arms, inspired by Matthew's words. The Xeraxian forces, already weakened by the sabotage efforts of Sarah and Mike, found themselves besieged on all sides. The streets rang with the sound of gunfire and the battle cries of the Evora as they fought for their liberation. In the days that followed, Matthew and his team were at the forefront of the revolution, leading strikes against key Xeraxian targets and rallying the rebels. The fighting was fierce and bloody, but with each victory, the Evora grew bolder, more determined. And as the Xeraxian forces began to crumble, as the people of Evora rose up as one, Matthew realized that their insane plan, the one that had seemed like such a long shot, was actually... As the Evora uprising surged across the planet, a new threat emerged from the stars. A massive Xeraxian fleet dropped out of hyperspace, the ships bristling with weapons. At their head was the Emperor's flagship, a behemoth of a vessel commanded by Princess Zara herself. Matthew watched in horror as the first salvo of orbital bombardment rained down on the planet's surface. Rebel strongholds were reduced to rubble, civilian populations caught in the crossfire. The stench of burning flesh and acrid smoke filled the air. "We have to stop this," Matthew growled, his fists clenched. "We can't let them slaughter the Evora like this." Sarah nodded, her face grim. "I've got an idea. It's risky, but it might be our only chance." She laid out the plan. Infiltrate Zara's flagship using a captured Xeraxian shuttle, posing as reinforcements. Once on board, they would split into two teams. Matthew and Sarah would head for the bridge to confront Zara directly, while Mike and Tarek would sabotage the ship's weapons and power core. It was a desperate gambit, but they had no choice. The fate of the Evora and the entire galaxy hung in the balance. The stolen shuttle shuddered as it docked with the Xeraxian flagship, the airlock hissing open. Matthew and his team emerged, clad in the distinctive armor of Xeraxian shock troops. They moved quickly, splitting up as planned. Matthew and Sarah fought their way through the ship's corridors, pulse rifles barking as they cut down Zara's elite guard. The Xeraxians were tough, their armor absorbing multiple hits before they went down. But the humans were tougher, driven by a fierce determination to end this war once and for all. They burst onto the bridge, weapons leveled at Princess Zara herself. The Xeraxian royal stood proud and defiant, her eyes burning with hatred. "Foolish humans," she sneered. You think you've won? You think you can stop me?" She gestured to the view screen, which showed the Evora homeworld below still under bombardment. "I have rigged this ship's reactor to detonate. When it does, it will trigger a chain reaction in the fleet, destroying this entire system. You have a choice, human. Surrender and watch the Evora burn, or die with them." Matthew's grip tightened on his rifle, his jaw clenched. He knew Zara wasn't bluffing. He could see the madness in her eyes, the ruthless determination to avenge her father at any cost. Beside him, Sarah was already moving, her fingers flying over a console as she tried to hack the ship's systems. Matthew just needed to buy her time. He charged at Zara, a wordless battle cry tearing from his throat. The princess met him head-on, her own blade flashing. They clashed in a shower of sparks, trading blows with lightning speed. Zara was fast, her movements fluid and precise, but Matthew was stronger, his human physique enhanced by years of combat. He pressed the attack, driving Zara back step by step. In the depths of the ship, Mike and Tarek were locked in their own desperate struggle. They had managed to sabotage the weapons systems, rendering the fleet's guns silent. But the reactor room was heavily guarded, the Zaraxian soldiers determined to prevent any interference. Mike and Tarek fought like demons, their weapons spitting fire as they pushed towards the reactor controls. But the Zaraxians were too many, their numbers seemingly endless. The two humans found themselves pinned down, unable to reach the control panel. Time was running out. The reactor's detonation sequence had already begun, the countdown ticking away inexorably. On the bridge, Matthew and Zara were still locked in combat, neither able to gain the upper hand. Sarah worked frantically at the console, sweat beading on her forehead. She was close, so close to cracking the system and disabling the detonation, but the Zaraxian encryption was unlike anything she had seen before, the algorithms constantly shifting and evolving. It was a race against time, a desperate struggle against impossible odds. But as Matthew traded blows with Zara, as Mike and Tarek fought for every inch of ground, they knew they could not fail. Too much depended on them, the lives of billions, the fate of the galaxy itself. They were human. They did not know how to give up, and they would not stop fighting, not until the very end. In the depths of the flagship's reactor room, Mike and Tarek fought desperately to reach the control panel. Zaraxian soldiers poured in from all sides, their blaster fire filling the air with the stench of ozone. Mike ducked behind a console, his heart pounding in his chest. They were so close, but the Zaraxians just kept coming. He looked over at Tarek, who was pinned down behind a stack of crates. The Evora rebel met his gaze, his eyes filled with a grim determination. In that moment, Mike knew what he had to do. "Tarek," he shouted over the din of battle. "When I give the signal, you make a run for the control panel. Don't look back, no matter what." Tarek opened his mouth to protest, but Mike was already moving. He pulled a grenade from his belt, his fingers trembling as he primed the charge. Taking a deep breath, he stood up from behind the console, the grenade clutched tight in his hand. He hurled the grenade into the midst of the Zaraxians, then turned and sprinted towards them, his rifle blazing. The soldiers scattered, trying to escape the blast radius, but Mike was already among them, his fists and rifle butts striking with brutal efficiency. The grenade detonated with a deafening roar, the shockwave slamming into Mike like a hammer blow. He felt searing heat wash over him, felt shrapnel tear into his flesh. But he kept fighting, kept drawing the Zaraxians' fire, giving Tarek the chance he needed. Through the smoke and the chaos, he saw Tarek make his move, darting out from behind the crates and racing towards the control panel. Blaster bolts whizzed past him, but he never slowed, his feet pounding against the deck plates. Mike felt a surge of elation as he saw Tarek reach the panel, his fingers flying over the controls. But then a blaster bolt caught Mike in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor. He tried to rise, but his body wouldn't respond, his vision growing dim. As the darkness closed in, he heard the sound of the reactor powering down. The detonation sequence halted. A smile touched his lips. They had done it. The ship was safe. The Evora would be free. "Not bad for a crazy human," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ringing in his ears. Then the world faded away and Mike knew no more. On the bridge, Sarah's fingers flew over the console, her brow furrowed in concentration. The Zaraxian systems were complex, their security measures formidable, but she was determined to break through. She could hear the sounds of Matthew and Zara's duel behind her, the clash of blades and the grunts of exertion. But she forced herself to tune it out, to focus on the task at hand. Suddenly the console lit up with a cascade of warnings, red lights flashing across the screen. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat as she realized what was happening. Zara had triggered a failsafe, a remote detonation sequence that would bypass the reactor's control panel and destroy the ship. Sarah redoubled her efforts, her fingers a blur as she worked to slice through the failsafe's encryption. She could feel the seconds ticking away, each one bringing them closer to oblivion, but she refused to give up, refused to let Zara win. With a final desperate keystroke, she broke through the failsafe's defenses, the detonation sequence grinding to a halt. A surge of relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. Behind her, she heard Matthew cry out in pain, heard the clatter of his weapon falling to the deck. Sarah spun around, her eyes widening in horror. Zara stood over Matthew, her blade poised for the killing blow. Matthew was disarmed, his face contorted in pain and defeat. But before Zara could strike, the bridge doors slid open with a hiss. Tarek burst through, his armor scorched and battered, his face streaked with sweat and blood. With a roar of fury, he charged at Zara, his blades flashing in the light. Zara turned to meet him, her own blade rising to block his strike. The two warriors clashed in a whirlwind of steel, their movements almost too fast to follow. Matthew staggered to his feet, snatching up his fallen weapon and joining the fray. Together, Matthew and Tarek pressed their attack, driving Zara back with a relentless barrage of blows. But the Zaraxian princess was a formidable opponent, her skills honed by a lifetime of combat. She parried their strikes with lightning speed, her blade darting in to land a series of quick, precise cuts. Tarek staggered back, clutching at a deep gash in his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, his face pale with pain, but still he fought on, his blades never slowing. In the end, it was Matthew who landed the decisive blow. Fainting low, he drew Zara's guard down, then lunged forward, his blade plunging into her chest. Zara's eyes widened in shock and pain, her mouth opening in a silent scream. She toppled backwards, her blade clattering to the deck. Matthew stood over her, his chest heaving with exertion. But there was no triumph in his eyes, only a grim determination. He turned to Sarah, who was already working to open a channel to the Evora rebels on the surface. "This is Matthew Green," he said, his voice ringing out over the comm. "The Zaraxian flagship is under our control. The fleet is in disarray. Now is the time to strike. Drive the Zaraxians from our world, once and for all. Today, Evora will be free." Across the planet's surface, the rebels let out a mighty cheer. They surged forward, their weapons blazing, their hearts filled with a fierce, unquenchable hope. The Zaraxian forces, already reeling from the loss of their emperor and their flagship, crumbled before the onslaught. Captured Zaraxian weapons turned against their former masters, cutting down the alien soldiers in droves. In the streets of the capital city, rebel forces clashed with the last remnants of the Zaraxian garrison. The fighting was brutal and bloody, but the rebels refused to yield. They fought with the fury of a people too long oppressed, a people who had tasted freedom and would never let it go. As the flagship's crew surrendered and the Zaraxian fleet fled the system, Matthew and Sarah raced to the medical bay, Tarek's limp form cradled in their arms. They laid him on a surgical table, his blood staining the pristine white surface. Sarah worked feverishly to stabilize him, her hands shaking as she applied pressure bandages and administered pain meds. Matthew stood beside her, his face etched with worry and fatigue. A chime sounded from the comm panel, and Matthew stepped over to answer it. The face of an Evora rebel appeared on the screen, her expression one of pure, unbridled joy. "Matthew Green," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "The Zaraxian forces are in full retreat. Our world is free. We owe it all to you and your team." Matthew felt a lump rise in his throat, tears stinging his eyes. They had done it. Against all odds, they had liberated an entire world, struck a blow against the Xeraxian Empire that would resound across the galaxy. But the cost had been high. Mike, Lars, and countless Evora rebels had given their lives for this victory. Their sacrifice would never be forgotten. He glanced back at Tarek, who lay pale and still on the surgical table. Sarah met his gaze, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. They had come too far to lose another friend. They would save him, no matter the cost. As the Evora people celebrated their freedom, as the Xeraxian forces fled in disarray, Matthew knew that their fight was far from over. There were other worlds still under the Empire's heel, other people crying out for liberation. But for now, they had achieved the impossible. They had given hope to a galaxy too long oppressed. And that was a victory worth any price. The streets of the Evora capital erupted in joyous celebration as Matthew and Sarah stepped onto the balcony of the former Xeraxian governor's palace. The sea of Evora faces stretched as far as the eye could see, their cheers and chants rising to a deafening crescendo. Tarek, his wounds bandaged but his spirit unbroken, stood tall beside them, his voice booming over the crowd. People of Evora, we stand here today as free beings, thanks to the courage and sacrifice of our human allies. The crowd roared in response, their voices filled with a mix of joy and sorrow. They knew the price of their freedom, paid in the blood of rebels and heroes alike. As the festivities reached their peak, a somber delegation from the Galactic Council approached Matthew and Sarah, their faces etched with grief. The lead delegate, an elderly Varian with piercing blue eyes, clasped Matthew's hand in a firm grip. Matthew felt his heart plummet, a cold fury rising in his chest. The Xeraxians' cruelty knew no bounds, their thirst for destruction insatiable even in defeat. The delegate pressed on, his voice heavy with urgency. The Council has authorized a new mission, one that we believe only you and your team have the skills and experience to undertake. You must track down the source of this bioweapon, neutralize it, and bring those responsible to justice. The fate of countless human lives hangs in the balance. Sarah stepped forward, her jaw set with grim determination. We'll do it. We'll make those Xeraxian bastards pay for what they've done. Matthew nodded, his mind already racing with the challenges ahead. He turned to Tarek, clasping his friend's shoulder. Tarek, The Evora rebel leader shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. Go, my friend. Your people need you now, just as mine needed you before. We will rebuild, we will thrive, and when you return, it will be to a new era of peace and cooperation between our worlds. With heavy hearts, Matthew and Sarah bid farewell to Tarek and the Evora, the weight of their new mission settling upon their shoulders. They boarded the Odysseus, now crewed by a hand-picked team of human specialists, each one driven by a burning desire for justice and retribution. As the ship lifted off, leaving the Evora homeworld behind, Matthew stared out at the stars, his mind haunted by the images of human suffering that the Council had shared. The insane plan to liberate Evora had succeeded, but at a terrible cost. Now, an even greater challenge lay ahead, one that would push him and his team to their limits. Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, her hand resting gently on his arm. We'll stop them, Matt. We'll make sure Mike and Lars didn't die in vain. Matthew nodded, his eyes hardening with resolve. The Odysseus tore through the void, racing towards the afflicted human colonies. Though the battle for Evora was won, the war against the Xeraxian Empire's legacy of cruelty had only just begun. Matthew knew he would not rest until the job was done, until the threat of the bioweapon was eliminated, and the Xeraxian leaders were brought to heel. The fate of humanity, of the entire galaxy, depended on it. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.